This will be another quite long video. It will cover looking over the turning pivot point on the forwarder and also fitting a few new bearings to the drive line to the back, and also some brake fuck ups from previous owners that I've found. If you have followed me a long time, you know they have just disconnected the brakes for the rear end. There is more to that story, it seems. It's some of it not the solution, but more problems will be shown towards the end of this video. It was used a little. We have gotten some snow by now. It's been stupid cold by the time this video, the recording was done. It wasn't stupid cold, but coldest recorded November in Sweden since 1980, it seems. Have seen minus 20 something where the house is, and just a kilometer away down the hill, I live kind of up on a hill, there they had minus 31. It was enough snow that you needed to activate the diff locks to go out and just collect a few wind-fallen trees before they are covered by snow and are lost. Then it was taken under a roof for looking over the turning pivot point and a few more things. This is an annoying cover. There are 3 different size sockets needed to undo it, partly because some mounts have been broken and new things have been welded in place. The crane was kind of moved a little to the side. It was opened up to give some better access to a hatch here. Also opened up the hydraulic tank if any of the hoses here were needed to be removed. Uh, the small drive joint is feeding power to the rear end were removed. Then there is 3 bolts on each, holding each pin in place, and kind of a metal plate. My dad had removed the pins for the steering cylinders, and it's tricky as usual trying to get any kind of decent video footage in here. And the radius for using the tool is quite limited being in here. And with it in with the locking bolts and stuff like that removed, we tried pushing it out, but a little small 2-ton hydraulic jack was not up to the task, and the block of wood also gave way, so a bigger jack was put in there. I think it's a 10-ton. My dad had built some supports so the machine wouldn't, if we were gonna need to. I was almost certain we were gonna pull it apart and replace bushings and such, but it turned out not to be the case. But with some sockets and other things to help push the pins, were possible to get all the way out without too much trouble. And there is very, very little wear on them. I also had a bore gauge to measure the diameter, and maximum 1/10 of a millimeter out of size on the bushings, and very, very minimal wear on the pins themselves. I did find that most of the play is actual up. I am not sure if it's actual axial or radial play, but I could fit in near one of the pins like almost a 1 millimeter steel or plate in there, and the other was 0.6, 0.7. So I'm just gonna push the pins back in and add shims to hopefully have less play in them there, but did find that the play in the bearing for the drive shaft going back here was quite big, and support bearing here in the middle also sounds quite rough, so they're gonna be replaced. This could be the sound I'm hearing, because I've had some bad sounds from the drive line somewhere. Some cleanup. Here you can see on the top there is a bronze bushing or bronze shim. There are also thinner steel shims you can add. Then trying to get the drive axle out, that would be a big undertaking, because we tried a tiny bit of pressure. We didn't think it would be a press fitting, as it turned out to be. That little 2-ton jack did nothing, and I couldn't push even with a lot of force, because we just pushed at the coupling for the gearbox, and that won't take all that force in that direction, I guess. So we just did a tiny bit of pushing and see if anything moved, but no. And also the machine started splitting apart because we didn't have the pins installed. So once we had gotten hold of suitable shims, I could only get the correct ones for the bottom half at first. The others were no. I had they thought they were half a millimeter and 1 millimeter, and I was gonna use that, but they turned out to be zero 0.5 and zero 0.3, the shim sizes that are available for this application from Komatsu, and I needed both of them at the bottom end, and at the top end here I just needed a half a millimeter. I couldn't fit anything more in there, so with them in place, the bottom one we used a hydraulic jack to push it up. The top one, after some tapping and ensuring it goes in straight, we brought out a bigger hammer for some gentle taps, and it slid right in without too much trouble. And then some of the lock bolts securing them could be reinstalled. And since we had given up on pushing the drive axle out, we could slide it out far enough forward that the bearing, the rollers could be removed, and the outer race could be removed, and then the cage could be cut with a Dremel and come out. The inner race could slide out through the seal that was on there, and then it could be slid all the way back into the rear of the machine, and could be started to bring it out. And there is a lot of old grease in there, so there will be some cleanup. And it's finally out of the machine. We removed the coupling for the drive joint that sits behind the support bearing here. I have some annoyance about that support bearing also later in the video. And in here, a lot of cleanup. I could dig out a lot of grease in there, because over the years the central lubing has pushed a lot of grease in there. It's not a big deal, but when installing new stuff and having access, I try to dig away as much of the old grease as I can without going crazy. The support bearing didn't want to come off easily either, so both the inner bearing race on the other end and the support bearing ended up being cut and removed. Did start to reinstall the steering cylinders and everything that's been apart. I added a grease connection so I could manually ensure everything was properly greased before the central lubing was hooked back up. Also opened up the underside of the machine to access. I was gonna grease all the drive joints now. Had placed a bit of that cloth that only collects oil, but it had collected, or some water had collected it. Things were frozen, so it was a little forced to get that out. There is another drive joint further forward with an access hole from the bottom, and there is also a, I think last time it was greased from the top, but now it was lined up so it could be greased from the bottom, so use that. Hydraulic tank could be lowered back down, and the cab was put back down. And here you can see that's the old seal that's been on the axle, quite loose, and the support bearing sounds like this. And here is the brand new unit.
Den här är ju bara 68, så den ska ju träffas ganska hårt läppen. Den här fanan måste ju vara 75 i den.
I think it has wobbled a tiny bit over the years. The drive shaft was not, the connections were not put in line either. And here, to make installation a little easier, we spent some time with a little bit of sandpaper and removed a little material, so it's more of a, not a press fit, just an interference fit, a tiny bit bigger. We could not see the reason, because the joint you bolt into place pushes on the inner race, so cannot understand why they need such a stupid press fit tolerance on the bearing here. The other seal in this outer part that pushes on the outer bearing race on the drive shaft, that seal was removed. Do a little test fit, and I could feel that it wiggles a little side to side, and we installed the new support bearing, and here we made a bit of a mistake. I think it's not huge, but my dad said that the grease fittings here don't grease the bearing, and he was correct, because he had cut it apart, and the grease fittings just grease the outside of the bearings, and there is a seal on each side, and that would be good if the seals actually seal up against something, because they don't seal up against the drive shaft at all. And had I realized that before we installed it, I would probably have removed the seals, because they will only hold water and dirt and stuff. They will not help out one bit, and putting any grease into that support bearing just adds grease that attracts dirt, I guess, because they do not seal up against the axles. Stupid design, or maybe they just didn't care and that was a unit they could buy. Well, back to the installation. I made a mistake, should have removed the seals. We had quite big issues trying to get the inner seal seated. I actually damaged it a tiny bit, the metal on it, but it jumped back out and we could bend things into place. We drove the here. I think the threads are a bit damaged. It took quite a bit of force installing that rear coupling on the drive shaft, and then we lined things up so they are in line with each other. They were not that when we removed them. Put some plastic protection to not get, because I had cleaned up the inside, but there was still some grease and stuff left. So then we had issues getting the drive shaft far enough back when we tried get it back in, so we had to open the access cover in the back, and my dad could help pull the rear end far enough inside the frame before bringing it forward for installation. And here we had the seal in place, and then we put the bearing on there. It was still needed a bit of tapping to get it to go on there. Once we had it tapped on far enough that we were sure it was on straight, we could put that coupling on there and the nut and start pushing it in by tightening the nut. Seal could be driven into that outer cover that will go over the drive shaft. I did grease everything, put a thin coat of grease on there to ease installation. We did some measurements to see how far in we had to get that, ensuring that the bearing was far enough in there and seated properly. Then that outer support that pushes on the outer bearing race could be put into place. We needed to get some extra long bolts to help, because we used the bolts to kind of tighten it into place, just going back and forth slowly and ensuring it went in there straight and not crooked. Added a bunch of washers when the bolts hit the bottom. Eventually we could start using the intended bolts that will hold it in its final position. Then the bolts for the coupling on the drive shaft. Really hard getting the inner ones in place. I wanted to get them to start threading on before tightening things up. Then realized we could turn it around. We had jacked up one side first and tried turning it. That did not go. So something is up with the brakes. But once we jacked up the entire rear end, there was no problems turning things around.
Och sen går det väl tvinga det där sista varvet på att jag satt.
Filling more grease into the places that we have had apart. And got like a squirting sounds like it's a tight fit, especially on the lower one here when pushing grease into it. Covered up, closed that rear cover, and since we had some brake issue, we started getting access to the differential in the back where the brakes are situated, and it had frozen by now, so had we done this a few days before, it would have been a lot easier, because we had quite mild weather back when we started this. Got a little confused about where the manual actuators are for disconnecting the brakes. I opened that cover, but that's to access the hoses that actuates the brakes. But there is some dirt and stuff down there and a bit frozen, and had checked the manual, and there should be 2 bolts on each side that you tighten down to manual disconnect the brakes. And after some digging around down there with a screwdriver and chipping away material, there are bolts down there. And one side they are tightened all the way down, this side. The other one was tightened down a tiny bit, it looked like, and the other one pretty much not at all, I guess. So the brakes on the rear left side have been dragging. This could be the reason why the oil in the rear differential turned so black so fast. It's not been dragging extreme, it's probably extremely worn out, but at least we could tighten the bolts. So now the rear end that already had plugged hoses now is fully disconnected, at least. As you heard earlier, we had the diesel heater running because we wanted to start it. We had to reconnect that the drive joint short piece in the center, get the bolts into place. And we knew that as it was lined up with the front end, there was very limited access to some of the bolts. And to ease up tightening the bolt, the machine was started so it could be moved a little. Crane was put back into its central resting position, and it was moved into location to have access to tighten the bolts. And I also lubed the rest of the joints on the drive line. So that's it for this video. New surprises every video almost.